So hello there guys and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope that you guys are doing well and staying safe, and a lot has been going on in the F1 world behind the scenes. We've got the teams now starting to reveal what dates they're going to be unveiling their new challenges for 2023, but of course that is all going to be happening in February. We're still well into January and there's plenty of F1 news still doing the rounds. And we recorded an episode quite recently for you guys regarding the prospective entries of not only Andretti, but also we talked about Panthera and other prospective entries like Hyundai or Ford or even Honda to certain degrees, and potential other outfits there looking to get into Formula One. And of course, the obvious obstacles they'd have to overcome, the application process, and a little bit more of that details. Of course, if you haven't checked that out, I definitely recommend that you do. But following that, there have been a few murmurs, a few unsettled voices from within the F1 paddock and F1 as a whole, which may not necessarily be as supportive of a new entry coming into the sport, to the detriment of what the fans would want, of course. But there's a lot to unpick from this, and this could well be the political storm that we get for 2023. Joining me on this episode of the podcast, we had him for the Andretti episode, and I'm really excited to have him back to talk about this story in a little bit more detail. It's F1 journalist working specifically for Planet F1, Sam Cooper. Sam, first of all, thank you so much for coming back on the show. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me back.
And obviously, you know, we were talking about the Andretti episode before. Of course, we talked about Panthera as well, where you had a great sit down with their prospective owner and obviously how they wanted to get into the sport. This story that's brewing right now, this political storm that we could be getting for F1 and the FIA in 2023, this obviously could potentially either benefit or hinder new teams coming into the sport right now. I do want to focus primarily on Andretti if we can, but I suppose the ramifications of this story could affect other new entries coming in as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think Andretti have been the public face of it, but from my understanding, there's at least 5 or 6 teams that have applied or are in the process of applying. So I think, yeah, Andretti is sort of the face of it, but I wouldn't be surprised if a few more names start popping up between now and when we find out who they are, really.
Yeah, absolutely right. Couldn't agree with you more. I'm just looking back through my phone. I should have been better prepared for this. It shows how good a job I am at doing this sort of thing. Mohammed bin Sulayem, the president of the FIA, he a couple of weeks ago put out an informal expression of interest, and we should say informal because it wasn't an official one by the FIA, but he basically tasked new prospective entries into the sport to try and prepare themselves for an application to come into the sport. And this was met largely by a lot of positive feedback from fans and a lot of F1 journalists like yourselves and podcasters like me, for example, at the prospect of a new team coming in. And obviously straight away, we had Andretti, Michael Andretti, Mario Andretti, leading that charge of new teams coming in, putting out an announcement with a partnership with General Motors and Cadillac for a prospective F1 entry. And obviously, everybody was excited about this. This was a proper American entry coming into the sport, potentially a manufacturer team as well, the likes of which we hadn't seen since, the days of Ferrari, Williams, Mercedes, for example, just to, name a few. And on the surface, it seemed like it was going to be pretty good. A lot of us were thinking, how is this going to go wrong? It seems to be a great thing coming forward, and hopefully this is something that may turn into a reality in the next few years. After that, we did get a tweet recently from Mohammed bin Sulayem again, saying that he welcomed the news of Cadillac and Andretti's partnership, and the FIA looks forward to further discussions on the FIA World Championship expressions of interest process. But he did go on to say that he was surprised that there had been some adverse reaction to this bid from Cadillac and Andretti, and that the FIA had accepted the entries of smaller, more successful organisations in recent years, and we should be encouraging prospective F1 entries from global manufacturers like General Motors and thoroughbred racers like Andretti and others. An interest from teams in growth markets adds diversity and broadens F1's appeal. Of course, I'm paraphrasing the quote from Ben Sulayem there, but I guess I have to ask, were you surprised to see that from Mohammed bin Sulayem, Sam? Because, like you said, like many other fans, I was a bit surprised to see there was some negative reaction, because overall it seemed to be quite positive.
Yeah, I think what we as fans on the outside doesn't always relate to what the teams feel. I think that's the general consensus, really, because obviously everything that we look at in the sport is from a sporting context. So, like, I think it's often said, a lot of the fans would agree that 12 seems to be the right number that fans want. But if you're a Formula One team owner and you get a slice of pie that's been cut 10 ways, you're not going to want to split it up another 2 ways. So, yeah, I think that it wasn't that surprising to see. I mean, we heard it all through last year, really. As soon as the Andretti bid sort of became public knowledge and like something they were exploring, like I think we heard from, well, Toto Wolff has been leading the way, really, sort of explaining that we're not just going to accept anyone because of their name, which is fair enough because it's Andretti, but he's always maintained that they want to see this value added to F1. What can this new team bring that sort of makes up for the loss they'll make by having another team in? And I think, yeah, the way Mohammed Ben Sulayem's acted has not been perhaps what people expected. I think people within F1 certainly weren't expecting the president to tweet out basically a call out, like a UFC call out on Twitter against F1. But yeah, it's been a very odd situation. I think it seems like a bit of a power grab from the FIA. I think they've had a few years of sort of being the bad guys of the sport, if that makes sense. So sort of we think of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix in 2021, that went down to the FIA, whereas F1 in the whole is like it's gone from strength to strength, really, hasn't it? If you think of the races they've added, the sport's growing more and more. So I think this is sort of the FIA's way. I think this is all speculation, of course. Like no one's actually told me this is what they're planning, but I think the FIA have sort of seen this as their opportunity to get the fans back on side. So if they think, okay, here's this Andretti bid, here's a team that a lot of fans like, especially very big in America, obviously with the series they do over there. If we can sort of be the cheerleaders for them, we can sort of get them onto the grid and we can show that we were the ones that did that and like achieve that. And if they go on to win championships or races or whatever, like the FIA can be like, we were the ones that helped get them in. So I think, yeah, there does seem to be a bit of, I think I've previously described it as a civil war. Like the FIA and F1 seem to be at different ends of the agreement, let's say, like they're not very in line with each other at the moment. I think the FIA very much lean towards more teams entering the sport, but then again, they're not as beholden to the current teams as FOM or F1 are yet. So like it's a difficult situation. I think everyone's got their own personal interest. I think everyone, some of it's money, some of it's sporting, some of it's they want to get more power. But yeah, I think it's a tricky mess, really. Like, right now, there's no obvious example of obvious example of what's going to happen, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, even F1, if we take that as a separate entity, because you've kind of got that holy trinity of Formula One, if you like, where you've got the FIA, you've got F1 or FOM, and you've got the F1 teams as a separate side. And the F1 and the F1 teams tend to align with each other on a lot of these political issues, if you like, mostly owing to the financial structure and the stability of the sport, particularly during the pandemic, which F1 quite openly owed a lot of that to the F1 teams and how they were managed to able to cope in those difficult situations and drive up that growth and expansion of revenue. And obviously the expansion, we talk about areas like America, obviously the market growing there. But looking at F1's response, they also were very lukewarm at best. I remember reading this and seeing it on social media, and it mentioned that there were other conversations happening, some a bit more private than others on this one, and they needed to make sure that the championship was never undermined. And I think this was a point that they highlighted specifically. They never actually had any direct coverage of the Andretti Cadillac news that came out of the blue. Of course, you covered that. F1 was never really involved in that. No coverage from the teams either in terms of their response to this Andretti Cadillac bid. And, it surprised a lot of people. The suggestion was that everyone seemed to be on board with this. The FIA seemed to be pretty happy about the news, judging from what Mohammed bin Sulayem says. But the F1 teams and F1 as a whole, not necessarily fans of this. For the benefit of those that probably don't really divulge into the political side of F1, or at least the deeper linings of this story, as it develops, I should say, why are the F1 teams and F1 as a whole not necessarily overly keen on expanding the grid or this particular bid from Andretti? And as a whole, who really decides which new teams come into Formula One? Is it as simple as saying Mohammed Ben Sulayem is happy and then that team is on the grid?
No, he has to get, so for a new team to be on the grid, they have to have both the agreement of the FIA and F1 in general. So even if Mohammed Ben Sulayem was as happy as Larry over team bid, they're not getting on the grid unless F1 also agrees. I think you're sort of getting two sides of the line like drawn on this issue. So you got FIA on one side who sort of are in favour, seem to really, really supportive of new teams, especially the Andretti bid. They've been very open about that. But you've got F1 and the F1 teams who are sort of on the opposite side of the fence. And I think the main difference is the FIA has no real control of the sport's finance. It's like the marketing divisions all through F1 itself, like they're in charge of all that, and like obviously the teams themselves have it profits and they all generate. So they're all involved in this the big financial side of F1, which is obviously a massive business and it's growing year by year. Um, I think the main reason that well, yeah, the main reason new existing teams don't want a new team is because say if you get profit every year, this is how much F1's made. That's then split up between the existing teams. So currently it goes 10 ways. So like it's all even, it goes 10 different ways, they all get a certain amount. If you add an 11th team, naturally that's going to make your share, if you're an existing team, a little bit less. And I think F1 teams aren't opposed to the idea of new teams joining outright, but they want to make sure that they're not losing money. So their big argument has always been, if you want to come to F1, you've got to show that you have value. So what that means is we want to see that you have enough value, whether that be with a new market you're going to bring F1 to, whether that's with a big investor, whether that's whatever. They want to see that the money you're bringing in is more than we're going to lose with you enjoying the sport and essentially cutting our pie an extra way. And I think Andretti hasn't convinced them of that. I think they've always been saying that. I think Andretti's big goal has sort of been, we're the American team, we're going to bring America. But I think on the flip side, there'll be a lot of teams who said, I don't know what much more we can do. Like it's been a massive expansion in the US, really. Like sort of, if Andretti was going to come in saying we're the American team, they've sort of missed the boat a little bit because obviously we've got 3 races in the US this year. These races are getting sold out almost instantly. Like more and more fans. If you look at the viewing figures for an F1 race in the US, they're shooting up year by year, and like it's just going upwards. So I think there's a very good argument, I think, that from the F1 teams that this value they're bringing in, it's not going to be that monumental. It's not going to be enough to outweigh the loss they're making of their profits being split up a little bit more. So yeah, I think when you first hear the news and when you sort of hear F1 teams being against them, they sort of come off as the bad guy. But I think if you take a chance to like think about it and peel away the layers a little bit more, it makes perfect sense for the F1 teams not to be too keen on a new member joining if they're not going to prove that they're going to get value. Because let's be honest, like it's an expensive sport to be in. I know there's a cost cap, but even that is an expensive amount. Like it's not the cheapest sport to be in. So if you're seeing your team essentially lose money, I mean, obviously it's a drop in the ocean for the likes of Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull, but there generally is teams on the grid that will notice a massive amount of their profit missing if another team joins. So I can understand entirely why they're not too keen. I think that's the hardest thing that Andretti have got to prove, is that they can bring enough value in. Like that's one of the, it's definitely the hardest part of the application process, is proving that value, because there's no real, it's not like the money where you can say, look, here's our accounts, we've got the money to give it to you. But this so-called values are much more like subjective term, and it's very hard for someone to prove that. I mean, I don't know what meetings they're having with F1 right now or what they're trying to show, but like there's got to be some way they can show they have the value if they want to get onto the grid.
Well, I mean, we can get into that in a moment, because I'm glad you brought that up. I'm really glad that you brought up the money side of things, because, you know, by trade, I'm an accountant. People that watch or listen to this show kind of know that if they've been following long enough. And this is one of those topics where I was really able to sort of apply my trade into this and try and do a little bit of digging and try and find out what the picture looks like. So if you indulge me for a moment, listeners or viewers, if you're watching this on YouTube, by the way, subscribe. We're getting closer to 1,000 subs, so, you know, help us out on that one. Looking at the F1 revenue for 2021, because at this point, I don't think they've posted the 2022 figures as of yet. It was around $2 billion. And the normal split between F1 and the the F1 teams is about 50-50 on this one. So of that, the F1 teams would have $1 billion to share amongst the rest of them. And as you know, Sam, it's not split evenly. There are plenty of different sub conditions, I suppose, of how that revenue is split between the teams. So I think, you know, you mentioned the special payments, like the one for Ferrari, the historical payment that is so controversial and everything that comes with that for just being Ferrari and their significance to F1. Whether you're a fan of that or not is up to you guys. You can let me know in the comments if you feel Ferrari should forego that in the next Concord agreement. Probably won't, but, you know, it's not revenue that they're missing. As you said, Sam, it's a pocket change almost to them in that regard. But they also have other historical payments to existing champions, the likes of Williams, Mercedes, McLaren, Red Bull. I don't know if Alpine slash Renault fit into that. They probably still do technically as an engine supplier, but you can make your own mind up on that one. So those sort of teams that exist, they still get payments from that revenue split. And overall, that's about 25% of that remaining revenue split. So you end up left with around $750 million left to split based on your performance in the Constructors' Championship. And as we all know, it's not split 10 ways. So it's not $75 million per team. I think the top team gets about 14%, and it's all the way down to last, gets about 6%. So even if we took it as an even split of $75 million per team, and we didn't have to worry about Constructors' Championship finishes, that's still a fair amount of money. It's it's just over half of the current budget cap at this point in time. But if you took that 200 million anti-dilution fund and you split that evenly between the 10 teams, that only really covers you for a short period of time. If a new team comes in and you have to, an 11th team takes around $6 to $10 million of that split, that's usually around about 2 or 3 years of coverage at best, probably 3 years if we're looking at the upper end of it, that 20 million covers for. So hope you guys are with me so far on this one. The point I'm getting at here is for 2022, the F1 revenue up to Q3 of the financial year, which was only just a few months ago, hence why we haven't got the final figure yet. F1 revenue is already up by this point by $500 million at this point. So obviously that revenue that's going to be split between the teams, 50% of that is $250 million. If we apply that logic to the previous years and the extra money that comes from that, all of a sudden, that 20 million per team does no longer cover them sufficiently for a certain period of time. Because of the added revenue, and an extra team would get a slice of that, they're losing even more money out of that. So long story short, guys, looking at that, I can understand why the teams, when they signed the Concord Agreement going up to 2025 a few years ago, they obviously thought $200 million was sufficient. That's no longer the case. And with the continued expansion for 2023 into Vegas and Qatar and, obviously other races that want to get on the calendar, expanding into further markets, if they manage to break into the Chinese market, if they have a race in China in the next few years, all of a sudden, that $200 million fee, buy-in fee, if you like, for new prospective teams is no longer sufficient to cover, if a team brings a tangible benefit into the sport, like a Andretti or a Panthera, for example, then great. But there is also that risk right now that they could come into the sport, pay that small fee, if you like, and relatively speaking is small, because obviously it's a lot of money still. I can understand why F1 teams are asking for $600-700 million as much as that, because they want further protection longer term. And right now they're not going to get that. Given the current expansion and growth in F1, and F1 expects the market to continue to grow, and as a franchise they expect F1 to continue to grow at that rate that it already has been this year compared to 2021. So all of the finance and all of the numbers aside, Sam, based on those figures alone, I can understand more now than probably when I was a few weeks ago when I recorded the first episode with you on this, why the F1 teams are definitely looking at this and thinking, the current terms are no longer sufficient to allow a new team into the sport under these circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. I think $20 million is obviously a lot to me and you, but like that doesn't go very far in the world of Formula One, unfortunately. Like that will soon run out. That's not a huge amount to give to a team. Like I can't work out what percentage of the cost cap it is, but it's definitely not near it. I think from an F1 point of view, let's be honest. Like Andretti are coming into it maybe because they have the sporting integrity. They want to be in it. Obviously, Mario Andretti's a world champion. Michael raced in it as well. But I don't think you should. I don't think that should be applied to Cadillac or GM. Really, like I think they're trying to get in it for the money. Really, they recognize this is a huge potential that's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. We've already seen it every year. I mean, you mentioned some of the figures there. Like they're getting in it because of the money. Let's make no doubt about that. But for the existing teams, I think they can fairly say, look, we've been through COVID in this sport. Like we were the ones who were there. We were the ones who were putting on races. We were the ones. I think F1 was one of the first sports back during COVID, which is mad, really, if you think it's the sport that travels the most around the world. But they can say, look, we've lived through this really hard time in our finances where we didn't even get a race one day, and then suddenly we were, and obviously all the extra measures they had to take to make sure it's safe. So I can understand why there's sort of that reluctance to allow someone in, like having not done the hard work, really, having not made the sport what it is. So yeah, like it's fair enough they can say that this 200 million isn't enough, really, because I can't remember off the top of my head when the last Concord agreement was signed, but it was a lot's changed since then. Like the sport has just gone through the roof in terms of popularity, especially in the US and increasingly so in Asia. So yeah, I think the Concord agreement is sort of outdated now. I think they could do with updating it. I don't know whether the 600 million that's been quoted is realistic, if that is a fair amount, because obviously that sort of encourages people not to apply, really, because that's a big hurdle to get over anyway. And it's even after you've completed that, it's not cheap to start your own F1 team. Like that will cost several times more to get it up and running. So yeah, I can understand why F1 teams in general aren't convinced either by the value or by the money, really. Like $20 million isn't going to get you very far, and they've lived through much worse in COVID times. So it is a lot of people who sort of wanted to get in on the gravy train. I mean, I don't think that should be taken away. I think these teams that are applying wouldn't be doing that if it was a sport in decline, if it was a sport that looked like it might be going out of business. I think Andretti get a pass, obviously, because they've sort of got this racing pedigree. They've got a history of F1. So I can understand, yes, there's a money element to them, but I think there will be a part that's generally we just want to compete in this and have an Andretti car in it. But yeah, I think some of the other teams that we're seeing return to the track or come to the track the first time are sort of getting in it, getting in it while it's good, I think.
Yeah, and that's a very fair point. You know, when it comes to racing pedigree, we should never question Andretti's, and there's no controversy around that really. But I mean personally, I certainly don't believe that their racing credentials is at any point in any part of the conversation in terms of whether they should be in the sport or not. I mean, teams can always throw that as an excuse, saying, "Oh, they've done this and done this," but where are their credentials when it comes to racing in Formula One? I think that's kind of a moot point in that regard. But in terms of the projected figures and what the teams are kind of suggesting. We mentioned already that anti-dilution fund. I think they really need to find a better name for that, quite personally. But looking at the figures that they're proposing, that is suitable for a new team to have to pay to come into the sport, it's quite a high figure. $600-700 million is a very high figure, and as you rightly pointed out, Sam, it's probably a figure that may deter entries from coming into the sport because they just don't want to take such a huge hit before they start seeing some sort of tangible benefits or on their investment. Do you feel that might be more of a negotiation tactic to set a high figure to the FI to say, well, look, this is what we think is actually more suitable, to bring them to the negotiation table with the backing of F1? Because of course F1 has gone on record in saying that the teams played a huge part in this expansion, and more importantly the sustainability of the sport during the pandemic, where money was very, very tight, and it was obviously a risk at the time where the sport was going to suffer or teams may go out of business. Do you feel overall that with those two entities aligned against the FIA, that huge anti-dilution figure they're proposing is more one to bring them to that negotiation table, to perhaps propose a new updated Concord agreement that could appease not only the teams but also prospective new entries that want to come into the sport but not have to fork out almost $500 million just to get in?
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Concord agreement is due to be renewed in 2025. So I wouldn't be
Hmm.
surprised if these teams now are sort of setting their stool out, really, saying this is what we want. Obviously, it's a common negotiation tactic anywhere, not just in Formula One. Like you ask high and you settle for a bit lower. So obviously, 700 is probably the extreme. Like I think F1 teams are realistic. They know they're never going to get it that high. Like the FIA won't agree to it. But if you go in saying we want 700 and you come away with 500, it looks better than if you. It looks better for both parties than if you go in saying you want 500 and you come away with 500. That doesn't look great for the FIA. It doesn't look like they tried very hard. But if you start high and sort of find a middle ground, it looks better for both parties. And I think we're getting to that point where teams are still starting to do a little bit of politicking. Like they're starting to say, okay, we want this, we want this. So I think often with these things, they're negotiated years before the actual negotiation happens, really. So by the time they sit around a table, I think it's pretty clear what each party wants and what is like a suitable middle ground for them, really. So yeah, I don't think there's going to be immediate change. I don't think they're going to come out tomorrow saying, okay, the new figure's this, because that wouldn't be fair to the teams that have sort of had these bids going, really. Like if you've been working for years under the assumption that there's a 200 million entry fee and suddenly that gets raised to 500 million, like your whole plan's gone kaput, really, in a day. So I don't think it's going to be an instant change, but I do think there is a change coming down the line, really, and that's I think that's perfectly reasonable. Like it's just in line with the sport's popularity and how much the sport brings in. Like I think if a new team gets on the grid, they're going to end up earning more than 200 million in the revenue they get. So yeah, I think it's perfectly fair to bring up these issues that it does need to be raised. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of we've heard people like Toto Wolff quoting saying as much as $1 billion would probably be the minimum that a new team needs to put up in order to get into the sport, and that includes stuff like the anti-dilution fund, the factory, the facilities, the staff, and everything else. I mean, if you include that $600 million figure into it, and I know this is hypothetical at this point, it's not really an accurate number. It's just the one that we've heard a lot in the media from the teams. It's probably a lot more than that. And that does raise concerns. Like, even if you have the richest of billionaire owners wanting to come into the sport and, the sort of owner that F1 wants to attract in that regard, I can't really see them justifying investing that much money just to put a team on the grid, even if it's a manufacturer team, which of course creates its own opportunity for growth and expansion in the same way that Andretti have been proposing with General Motors and Cadillac. Audi, for example, spent 600 million, I think it was, to buy into Sauber. And right now, Sam, that probably seems like the more viable option right now for. I know Andretti tried to buy into Sauber themselves, and obviously that fell through. And, there have been other teams that may look to be bought into, like Williams, for example, with Porsche in the future. This is purely speculation at this point. It feels like right now that route is still the more sustainable method, not only for new teams coming in, but also for F1. And whilst that model is perhaps the more sustainable one from a financial perspective in the short term, it's obviously not the popular one amongst fans.
Yeah, definitely. That's obviously the easiest route because like new teams can't argue they're taking away value because you're just replacing the existing team. But I think the way it currently is, I don't think any teams for sale really. I mean, there's been rumors that AlphaTauri might be up for sale if Red Bull get the right deal, but that's all very heavy speculation at the moment. Red Bull have said nothing on the matter, and I think Williams came out and denied that they were up for sale. So I think most of the teams now, I mean, you'd be mad to sell now. Like, stay in the sport while it's good. Like, you've gone through the hard times. Like, it's now time to reap the reward, really. Like, yeah, I think teams are gonna have to. Well, I think that is the easiest way to get in, but I think there's no teams that want to sell right now, which makes total sense. And I'm just going back to Toto Wolff's quote. I'd be interested in how he got to that figure because obviously that seems absurdly high. Like, I don't doubt it's up near that, but $1 billion seems really high. Like, I don't know if he's mean literally from ground zero, if you're starting from nothing, because I think with Andretti they've got the big bonus. Obviously, they're already a racing team. Like, they've got a factory built. I know they need to do some additions, and they're currently doing those additions for F1, but they're not starting from nothing really. So at least they've got
Yeah,
that
very
base to
true.
build on
Yeah.
really. Like, and also there are ways to save money in F1. Like, you can buy your power unit and you can buy wind tunnel time and you can sort of save bits and pieces like that. So whether Toto's estimation was from literally nothing to becoming a race winning team, I think $1 billion is probably billion plus more would be cost you that. But there are ways you can save money in F1 that mean you're not going to spend that high figure. So yeah, I think that's fair enough for him to say, but we'll see if that comes true really.
Yeah, very true. I mean, we look at Mercedes and how they got into F1. Obviously, they bought into an existing team themselves, become a manufacturer as we all expected them to. And it's quite a hard exercise, really, for teams to try and, start from the ground up. Of course, Andretti, as you mentioned, wouldn't necessarily be a team starting from the ground up. I think it's probably rather an exceptional case, whereas perhaps someone like a Panthera, for example, probably would be more of a team that has to do it from the ground up and obviously see how that would go. As well as, well, they seem quite serious, but, figures like that seem more of a deterrent at this point to protect that sustainable model that F1 currently has. And perhaps for the existing teams in the short term, that is the best model going forward. And, I'd imagine if someone like a mega entry come in, and I'm not just talking about Andretti Cadillac, because at the time I was certainly talking about them as that mega entry as a manufacturer that would bring a huge tangible benefit to the sport in terms of revenue growth and expansion. It feels like unless it's something crazy like that, and Andretti Cadillac is the real deal. And I will get into what I mean by that in a moment, because there is a bit of a cynical approach you could apply to this particular entry. It just doesn't seem that the teams are going to get on board with it, quite frankly.
No, yeah, I think if you're not going to accept Cadillacs, then like there's a very few small limit of teams that you will accept. I think Turtle Wolf in particular has always been much more receptive to the Audi bid. I think that's some of the interesting. I don't know if it's that German connection with Mercedes and they sort of trust that Audi will do a good job. But yeah, I think the bar is set very, very high for teams to sort of accept you as one of their own, really. Like, they need to see, I don't know who's bigger than Cadillac, but like Ford or someone like that, or someone like a huge name getting it. Like, that would only be the way that a team could get in. Imagine. I think like we obviously seen that Porsche having their troubles getting in. Like it's no done deal, even if you are a huge name, both in racing and just car manufacturing in general. Yeah. So like it's not an easy task for anyone really to get into the grid. I think Andretti have a better chance than most, but I'd love to see the other names that have sort of been rumored or linked with a spot or trying to get a spot at least.
Yeah, very true. And as you pointed out earlier, it's one of those right now that whilst the teams want to protect that sustainable model, obviously they need to make sure that that this Andretti Cadillac deal is the real deal. And of course, if they'd have come a few years ago before the expansion was really happening in the US, perhaps it would have been the right time to get on board with it. But going on, we're already having that expansion, and the only thing missing is a proper American F1 team. But does F1 really need one? Maybe, but it's not exactly something the teams probably share in terms of what they would want for F1 going forward to try and create extra revenue and improve this expansion and growth. One thing I did want to talk about, and this is kind of the cynical analysis of Andretti's Cadillac bid, and the F1 teams, from what we understand of the process, Sam, and what we talked about before in the last episode, it's going to be a very private process. The public, the general public, won't necessarily be privy to the details of this application until they are made public, and at that point, it could be accepted or it could be denied at this point, and we may not know the details of it at all. And that's something that concerns the teams, because what they would want to scrutinise, and I've heard a few people mention this, and this isn't my opinion, this is, a few people that I've spoken to about this, and they've mentioned this particular opinion on the Andretti Cadillac bid, is this just an Andretti with a Cadillac badge put on it, or General Motors badge on it? Is it a badging exercise, I think is a better phrase, or is this the real deal? Because you could compare it to Aston Martin. For example, we had the Racing Point team. Lawrence Stroll wanted to bring Aston Martin into Formula One, but he basically purchased the rights to put the branding on the car and call it Aston Martin, and everything that the team represents the car company as a whole. But it's not actually Aston Martin, technically speaking. It kind of is by name, but it's not, they don't use the Aston Martin facilities. They don't use the technical knowledge. They don't use any of the know-how or anything like that. It's literally Racing Point, but with the Aston Martin branding attributed to it and everything that comes from it. Is the Andretti Cadillac bid the same thing? Is it just Andretti paying a lot of money to General Motors and Cadillac to say, look, we've got an opportunity to get into F1. We need you to put your name to this. We need you to put your badge to this so that it gains a bit of traction. It gains a bit of prestige. People think that we're a manufacturer team, but they're not actually using their technology. We're not actually using their know-how. We're not using their facilities. We're just paying them for the rights to put their branding on our bid so that it looks more prospective and that people think we're an actual manufacturer team, when the reality is they're not in that regard. What do you make of that? Do you feel that that's anywhere near accurate with Andretti, or do you feel that that's just a concern the F1 teams are trying to put forward to potentially scupper this potential bid?
I think Cadillac will help. I think they'll share their knowledge. I think it's key to point out that they're not making their own engine, at least in the start of the coming out. So I think it's fair to say that whatever car it be, if it does get to the grid, will most likely be a Renault with a not an Alpine badge, sorry, with an Andretti / Cadillac badge slapped onto it, because it's not something they're going to do themselves. I think there were talks that they were going to sort of look into that. Obviously, but then again, they've got an existing relationship with Honda, do Cadillac, so it'd be sort of make sense for them to go to them. That's another thing entirely, really. Like if you start creating your own car entirely in house, there are very few teams that do that. Obviously, Mercedes do that, Ferrari do that, and Red Bull are close to doing that. They're sort of moving everything on base now as it is, and obviously Alpine do it as well. But yeah, that's sort of the next level. It's getting on one thing, getting onto the grid as a customer team, and then it's another thing entirely sort of becoming your own independent team. It's hard to know what the relationship between Andretti and General Motors is. I think it's the perfect relationship for them, really. That Andretti have the desire to get on the grid, like they've always wanted to do it, but they just didn't have sort of that name backing behind them. So they found the perfect partner in GM, who said before they wanted to get F1, but they didn't really have the right time, and they said they were convinced by Andretti to do it now. So I think it's a perfect partnership, really. I have no doubt that about 80% of the work will be done by Andretti. Like, I feel like that's been made pretty clear, just the way both parties have talked. But I think Cadillac would be mad not to put some of their expertise into it, because if at the end of the day that car is representing their brand, especially that's obviously another huge reason why they've got into the sport. It's sort of changed that public perception of Cadillac. 'Cause I don't know about you, but when I think of Cadillac, I think of massive cars that
Mm.
can't turn around corners. So like they're definitely trying to sort of refresh their brand, similar to what Mercedes did 12 years ago, whatever it is now. But yeah, I think there will be. I mean, it's just something we won't know really till the operation gets going properly. But I think the large part will be done by Andretti, and I don't really share the opinion that Cadillac are just there to be a name. I think they will have some input because they're a racing team as well, obviously in different series. They're not entirely new to racing, so I think yeah, they will have some. I think there'll be a point of pride as well, really, sort of say, well, yeah, we helped with this, we made this car a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I should mention for the benefit of integrity on this show that, I'm not suggesting at all that this is a badging exercise from Andretti. And I'm certainly not putting words in your mouth, Sam, that that is what you think either. And I agree with you on this one. I definitely think that there is a level of legitimacy to Cadillac and General Motors' interest in being a part of this as a manufacturer with Andretti, rather than it just being a case of like what happened with Aston Martin and Racing Point, where they just agreed, yeah, that's fine, you can brand this as an Aston Martin and just carry on as you were, and everything that comes from that. It's just a perspective that I believe that some of the teams will most likely have or put forward in an attempt to make sure that they appropriately scrutinise this bid from Andretti Cadillac, because of course, as we said already, it's going to be a very private process. We may only get so much detail from the application, if any at all, from the FIA. They haven't really outlined how this process is going to look or what it's, how public this is going to be. I imagine if it's the real deal, perhaps Mohammed Ben Sulayem might be more willing to make it more public, or if it's not quite as we'd hoped it would be originally, they might try and keep a few details under wraps to those that don't really necessarily need to know. I mean, you talked about this earlier, Sam, with Andretti, and I think a lot of this need for scrutineering this potential application from the F1 teams has probably come from, previous things that have happened with Andretti. For example, how the Sauber deal fell through. Obviously, the lack of agreement on the ownership of the entity, and obviously some of the financial figures involved with that. And also what happened in Miami when Mario Andretti was running around with a petition at that event, trying to get some of the F1 teams to sign it to support back their bid into the sport, with only McLaren and Alpine actually signing it. So it's one of those where they kind of risk putting a few noses out of joint. And I kind of feel that that might be why Mario Andretti has aligned with the FIA on this one to put this bid through, rather than the F1 teams in the more traditional sense. Do you think that's a bit of a mistake from Andretti's side? Do you feel that they've potentially put a few too many noses out of joint, and especially doing so even more by aligning with the FIA in terms of their route to try and get in, rather than the F1 teams?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's fair. I think, as we've mentioned, that they're definitely the most public, well, most forward-facing bid out there, and I think that's a tactic they've used because I think they've sort of relied on themselves being this established racing brand, and they've sort of made a point of being a team that they think fans want. So they're trying to use fan pressure to get other teams to agree with them and sort of paint F1 and F1 teams as the bad guy, really, not letting us in kind of thing. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a bit of not bad blood, but like just bad feeling about the way they've gone about it, the way they've been so public. Like you said, with Michael Andretti running around the grid trying to get people to sign was probably not something that pleased the 8 teams that didn't sign. But yeah, I mean, it's just been a very open. It's been interesting from our perspective because obviously we've sort of seen this bid evolve. Really, like we've seen it first come in as, like you mentioned, like this Sauber takeover that didn't work, and then about this time last year, they sort of announced that, okay, we've put the bid in, and we didn't really know what that meant this time last year. What they submitted a bid, but no one knew exactly what that meant. And it's been slow process since then. And they've got the GM announcement and now the expression of interest. So yeah, I think it's been interesting from our point of view to see how this thing develops. But as a team, as an existing team, it's probably not how they do business. I think F1 is generally, there's not a lot of open negotiation. I think it's very much behind closed doors, and we only sort of find out until it's been completed, really. I mean, I think the most recent example obviously was the cost cap of Red Bull. Like no one really knew what was going on until it was announced officially what was going on. But yeah, I can't imagine he's made too many friends in the paddock with the way they've gone about it. But I think from their point of view, that was their best chance of getting on the grid, is sort of harnessing fan power and fan pressure to sort of make them seem like, okay, we're the fans team. Fans want us here. Like, you can see that. And whether they are wrong to line with the FIA, I'm not sure really, because I think that's quite a valuable ally to have. Because if they're getting a warmer reception from the FIA than they are from F1, then it sort of makes sense to put all your eggs in the FIA basket, because at least that's one half that's done. That's one half that's been sorted. So I don't blame them for the way they've gone about it, but I can sort of understand why certain teams wouldn't be too pleased how it's happened really.
I mean, it makes me question the actual process or how it currently exists for new prospective entries to come into the sport before this application process or expression of interest was announced by Mohammed bin Sulayem, because from a fan perspective, it's not a good look for Formula One or the Formula One teams in general if they want to try and put potential blockers or obstacles for new entries coming in, especially at a point where the announcement by Mohammed bin Sulayem was so well received by the general public or F1 fans as a whole. And I don't think it's a coincidence either that Andretti Cadillac, if you like, the bid immediately followed Ben Sulayem's expression of interest tweet. I imagine when you were invited to cover that particular press conference, that probably caught you a little bit by surprise. But obviously, immediately in the aftermath, when you'd seen the timeline of events, how they happened, it probably ticked in your mind that, oh, okay, there've probably been some discussions between Andretti and the FIA on this, and obviously these announcements being so close to each other, it was not a coincidence at all. There's obviously a lot of work going on behind the scenes before it was all put together.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's all sort of stars aligned. I think Andretti was talking to GM for about 4 or 5 months before this deal was made public, at least. And yeah, like I said, it was a bit of a surprise, really, to see Andretti and General Motors making a joint announcement, because everyone sort of wondered what this was about, even if it was about F1. Yeah, I think there have been a lot of workings together. Like, it obviously makes sense. Start of a new year, let's get this process rolling. And I think it's good, at least, that now there's sort of an official way to get into F1, even if it's still a bit murky on exactly what that is. Like, at least now there's a process teams can follow. And this is sort of, obviously, everyone's now the guinea pigs of this process to see what's involved and with it. I think the details of it are going to be finalized by the end of this month. So hopefully they're made public so we can all see what these teams are being judged on. I mean, I can't imagine the bids will be made public until, if ever, really. If they get failed, I can't imagine any team will publicly announce that. But yeah, I think it's good that a process now is involved. And like you said, I think there has been a lot of workings with the FIA and Andretti. But saying that, I think the FIA have probably done that with a lot of teams that we just don't know about. I think Andretti have just been the most vocal on that front. I think and the FIA are quite good at working with teams who want in, really. Like, they'll, as long as you've shown you're serious and you have the money and the technical capabilities, like, they'll treat you as they would have Andretti, I guess.
Well, this is where the political storm starts to take shape right now. I mean, we talked about the money side of things, and the relationship between Andretti and the existing F1 teams and F1 as a whole not necessarily being the most welcoming at this point, or warm, if you like. And, from what I understand, the current Concord Agreement, whilst I haven't read it back to front, does currently give F1, as the commercial rights holder, a veto over to whether or not to go beyond the 10 teams as it currently exists. And for me, given that F1 are going to align themselves with the current F1 teams and what they want, they're going to back them wholeheartedly, it does feel that right now this process is almost held a little bit to ransom, unless Andretti and any other teams that want to come into the sport with the assistance of the FIA, I suppose, in this process, can actually prove to these teams that this is actually financially viable for them to allow new teams coming into the sport. It does feel that that's where the stalemate is going to be.
Yeah, definitely. I think after this FIA process is done, that by no means means the war's over, really. That's just the first battle, really. Like, I think the much harder task of convincing the F1 teams that they're a worthwhile bid sort of starts then, really. Like, I don't think the F1 are ever going to overrule the F1 teams, because they're very much dependent on them. Like, they need to make sure they're happy, and like, because they're sort of putting in the same direction, really. Because obviously, if F1 does well, the F1 teams do well, and if the F1 teams do well, then the F1 does well. So it's a very nice partnership between the two, and like, they're never really going to disagree that much with each other. So yeah, I think Andretti's sort of aiming for a 2025 bid. Like, I think even that is optimistic, and that's what 3 seasons away from now. So I think there is still a lot of work to be done. This is something that's going to drag on, even as the season gets going. I think the drama of it and the politics of it has sort of been heightened by the fact that it is in the off season. There's not a lot of topics to go about, because imagine if this was during a season, like we would have had the announcement that we would have had probably 2 or 3 more races since then, and it would have seemed like old news. But because there's not that race and not that focal point, and we haven't even had the car launches yet, there's not something to take our minds off of really. This news sort of rumbles on slowly, and I think it is something that is going to take a long time. Like it's going to get, I wouldn't be surprised if we get to the end of this year and there's not been a definite answer one way or another. So yeah, I wouldn't expect, if there's any Andretti fans listening, I wouldn't expect to start buying the team colors anytime soon. I think you're gonna have to wait a few more years for that. I think this isn't a process that's going to be over anytime soon. I think it's something that is going to carry on even as the season gets back underway.
Yeah, that is very, very true. And, for me, I've heard a few people mention, because of the souring relationship between, the Andretti clan, if you like, and the existing Formula One teams, mostly owing to how, I suppose, vocal Andretti have been on getting an F1 team into the sport, and perhaps how they've used that fan power, if you like, as a political move to try and put pressure on the existing F1 teams, as well as aligning with the FIA, rather than going down the F1 and F1 teams route in trying to get a team on the grid, as it was done so often in the past. It feels to me that, as some people have mentioned to me, that the solution to this seems to be that perhaps Mario Andretti, Michael Andretti, and Cadillac GM need to get together, present a presentation to the F1 teams in a meeting. It doesn't have to necessarily be private, with the FIA sort of hosting it, where they can present themselves to these teams and say, look, this is what we're doing. This is the bid that we're going to make. This is a manufacturer bid. This is not going to be Andretti with a Cadillac GM badge on it. And this is the financial tangible benefit that it's going to offer to you guys in F1, with either the 200 million anti-dilution fund or something a little bit bigger, depending on what you'd agree with. Do you feel that that's potentially the best solution right now, if for an Andretti perspective? And also, do you feel that Andretti should do that?
I don't think that I don't think the teams would agree to sit around to that really. I think these kind of deals sort of happen in a phone call somewhere, like this off chance meeting. I think it's very rare that, I mean, it's hard enough to get the team principals in a room anyway, even if it's not to do with another team joining. Like they're very busy people. And I also think this is just a bad time of year for it, really, because obviously we've just come at the end of a really long season. So, like, granted, and like, fair enough, all these people have gone on massive holidays. They've been away for weeks. And then when they come back, they'd much rather be focusing on their new car, the new season ahead, rather than thinking about this team that wants to get in. So, yeah, I'm sure Andretti would love to sit them all down and sort of explain why it's better for them and like what's going to happen. But I don't think that's realistic. I don't think the team principals would all agree with that. And also, I think you sort of have to have a different negotiation tactic really with each team. Like, I think some of that Mercedes wants isn't going to be the same thing that Haas wants. Like, each team principal is going to want something different to show the bid's worthwhile. And Andretti's sort of got to find that happy medium, saying that this is what we can bring and this is what we can do, really. So yeah, I think as much as he'd love to get them all in a room and sort of not let them leave till they agree with him, I just don't think that's realistic. Like, these are all incredibly busy people. Like, they just don't have that time in their calendar. Or, I mean, why would they want to really? If they've already sort of made up their mind, like, that's fair enough. But they don't have to sit and listen to what you've got to say. So I think, yeah, I think the approach they'll take is, and I've no doubt this has already started happening, is sort of like trying to have not secret meetings, but meetings behind closed doors that aren't that public, and sort of hash out what each team wants, really, to show that they do have a viable option, really.
And I think that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? Because if you're an F1 fan hearing that, my heart almost sinks a little bit, because I actually want this Andretti bid to go through, assuming that it is legitimate, as Andretti are currently claiming that it is at the moment. I don't want this to be a badging exercise. I want this to be a proper American manufacturer team, and I certainly hope that it is, rather than what we're seeing on the surface right now. We'll just have to wait and see when the details do come out. I'm sure they will in due course. But I don't think that's actually a bad idea. And I agree, as you mentioned, rightly so, that there has to be a level of compromise, not only from Andretti, but also from the existing F1 teams, to be a bit open-minded, to say, okay, we're going to provide you the forum to hear you out. And if you can prove to us that this is a mega bid, as you so rightfully claim, then we can look at potentially seeing if your application can go through and try and get you on the grid for 2026. Because we're not talking about getting them on the grid anytime soon. This is something that's going to be happening in a few years' time. But I just feel that there has to be a level of compromise on both sides to make this happen. I feel like if the F1 teams are going to be, put in a position where they're under pressure to try and, accept these new entries. But obviously, if they're not being willing enough to be open-minded and allow teams to, put forward an entry, and if they're not good, they can rightfully say, well, you're not good enough, so you can't come in. The fan perception of these existing teams is going to get worse and worse. And something that I remember you saying specifically on this show last time you were on, Sam, was the American market saying, well, you're obviously interested in our money, but you're not interested in us taking part. That could obviously have a huge detrimental hit on the potential of growth and expansion in the American market that F1 has done so much to actually create for themselves over the last 5 years.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's a very valid reason, a very valid point that I've definitely heard a few fans say that before. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Haas lean into it more now, having got that title sponsor of an American company. And like Andretti can say that they're an American team and they've sort of got that behind them. But I think I wouldn't be surprised if this season coming that we see Haas really lean into their American roots. Really, they don't have that Russian sponsor anymore. They have this American sponsor, and their headquarters. Let's not forget, even if none of the car, or not a lot of the car gets made there, is in America. So I think Andretti's argument that they're the only American team is obviously a strong one because they're sort of claiming that we're going to make the whole car over there. It's going to be very much an American team. But I wouldn't be surprised if Haas sort of say like, oh, okay, look, Andretti's trying to claim to be America's team. Let's really ramp up our efforts. Let's show that we are America's team because they are branded as America's team, like in F1, Haas are currently. So yeah, I think it's a perfect opportunity for Haas, really. Like Andretti, the ones saying there's a market for it, they should be the ones that sweep it up, really.
No, absolutely. I think that would probably be a good thing for American F1 racing. I mean, it's probably not the solution that, if you ask the average American F1 fan right now, that they probably want. But I think if Haas are to embrace their American roots and heritage a little bit more than they currently do, I don't think many people would complain about that. And perhaps that is something they themselves need to expand into a little bit more, other than just saying, yeah, we're the American team as soon as they turn up to Miami, Vegas, or even COTA at this point in time, where obviously that's what we see at the current point in time. I mean, a lot to talk about, and it's going to be quite an interesting process. I suppose the final question for this one, Sam, is, we've talked a lot about Andretti already. There are other prospective entries. Obviously, you covered Pantera in great depth the last time that we talked to each other, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of developments with that particular project and any more coming out of the woodwork rather than just being very private at this point in time, I suppose. We don't know at this point how many prospective entries there are. We've only heard of Andretti and, thanks to journalists like yourself, Pantera as well, in a bit more detail. But with what we've seen from Andretti right now, if this proves to be the real deal and they are serious and they have all that backing from General Motors and Cadillac, the financial backing as well, the facilities and everything that points to the direction of this application being accepted, but it doesn't get accepted because the F1 teams put a blocker on it, is that going to be the nail in the coffin for any potential teams coming in? Because right now, other than the two that we've talked about, I can't really imagine a much more suitable entry coming into the sport than those two at this point in time. And that could put off potential new entries from coming into the sport if they're not even close to replicating that.
Yeah, definitely. I think this Andretti is sort of the litmus test, really. Like they're sort of the guinea pigs, seeing how this new situation works. And if they don't succeed, then you're right. Like there will be a lot of people thinking, oh, if they can't do it, then we've got no chance. So like, I think it is quite a pivotal moment. I'm still very pessimistic. I think we will get to 2026 and we'll still have 10 teams on the grid. What 10 teams there'll be, I'm not entirely sure at the moment. But I think, yeah, it's looking. If you asked me to put money on it right now, I'd say that there's not going to be a lot of change. And I say this Andretti bid as it is just doesn't seem like it's going to happen really because they've had such a fierce backlash from the F1 teams and they don't seem to be shifting really, no matter what they say. So yeah, I think you're right to say that they're sort of paving the way for these new teams to come forward. And if Andretti and a huge company like General Motors can't get in, then yeah, what other chances have other people got really?
Yeah, and sadly, I kind of share those sentiments as well on that one. So if you're listening to this podcast and you want to feel a little bit more upbeat about Andretti's entry, then go a few weeks back and listen to the last one that we did because we were a lot more positive about it then. But of course, we're still in the very early stages. We've only heard rumours and whispers and certain voices giving their opinions. We'll just have to wait and see what comes out, as you mentioned, Sam, a little bit later on in the year when this application process takes shape a little more. But of course, a huge political storm seems to be brewing, and I definitely feel that this is going to be the talk of the season. outside the racing, of course, which I'm hoping will be the main event. But Sam, before we sign off, just to let our followers who haven't seen your great work, where can they follow you on social media for more insight from yourself?
So on Twitter, I'm Sam Cooper with an underscore after it. And then on Instagram, it's Sam Cooper F1. And I will say I'm going to the Alpine car launch. So if you want to see behind the scenes footage of that and like the first view of the car, then make sure you're following those two accounts for February 16th, I believe is their date off the top of my head. But yeah, make sure you're following those two.
Yeah, I believe that's about right. I think thinking about AlphaTauri might be the latest one. I know Haas haven't announced theirs yet, but of course, plenty to look forward to with the car launches. I sincerely hope that when you do go to the Alpine launch, Sam, that they will actually show you a car rather than
if I
what
see a
Renault
digital
did.
render on a screen, then I won't be very happy. I'll be like, I came all the way for this. Hopefully there's a real car and hopefully there's a real Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon with it.
Yeah, absolutely, and hopefully they're brothers in arms rather than obviously what a lot of fans have been hearing over the past, which has kind of led to why this potential battle between the two of them could be quite spicy for 2023. But of course, that's all speculation and conjecture at this point. Yeah, and I absolutely agree. Hopefully they do provide a real car for you. I mean, what's your take on these launches? Because as a fan, I know that a few teams like to make a big song and dance over it. I know Ferrari do a very private thing now, but it's a bit of a show. I know Mercedes did their Sky Sports coverage last season of their new car, and then we had Red Bull pretty much rolling out the F1 2022 spec car rather than their own one with a livery. I'm expecting them to do the same thing, given their launches on the 3rd of February, like nearly 2 weeks before the Alpine one, for example. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on these car launches? Do you think that they should just be scrapped, or do you feel that they should just try and make a big show of it like they used to back in the early 2000s?
I like him. I think they've got their place to sort of get people excited for the season. I mean, I'm under no impression that any of the cars we see in the next few weeks are going to be the same ones we see on the track in Bahrain. Like, I think you're right to say that they're going to be entirely different by the time we see them come out. But yeah, I think it is worth doing. I think it's exciting to get sort of see the teams again, because obviously the last time we saw these teams in action was a few months ago now. Yeah, so I can understand why people don't like them. I think it's sort of leaning into that Netflix Drive to Survive kind of drama, sort of like pandering to the audience. But then again, I think it is better. Like, I think it's an enjoyable event to see what these teams come up with creative wise, and yeah, hopefully the New York ones at least are something different than we usually see.
Yeah, definitely. But we'll have to wait and see, of course, guys. And we'll be talking about each of the new cars for 2023, what we like, what we don't like, and of course, what we feel they need to work on for next season. But until next time, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. And of course, if you have enjoyed this episode, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know your comments on the potential political storm brewing between the FIA and the F1 teams regarding the Andretti bid and any prospective new bids coming into the sport. Whose side are you on? Which side, I suppose, should have control of this process, or should there be a bit of input from everyone? We'll have to wait and see. But of course, if you're listening to us on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to leave us a 5-star review. We did get a 5-star review on Spotify recently, which, of course, thank you so much for doing that. But please let us know that you've done that, because of course on Spotify it doesn't tell us who's done them. So if you want to shout out, get in touch with us on our social medias, and of course you'll see those in the show notes. So let us know so we can give you a shout out on the next episode. But until next time, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Please stay safe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.